Hello and welcome to Lore Watch, a roundtable freeform discussion about lore and our favorite, well, everything at this point. I'm one of your hosts, Joe Perez, one of several lower-focused folks over at Blizzard Watch, and I've got my stupendous co-host with me today, Matt Rossi. How you doing today, Matt?
It's weird. I was up all night working on something, and I was trying to come up with a list of influences, like media that reminded me of the thing I was working on, and that got me. It took me down the rabbit hole of what indicates an influence. Like when is it an influence versus when is it just something that's kind of like the thing you're talking about?
That is an interesting distinction.
Yeah. And one of the things is, like, I was thinking about Misfits of Science. Remember Misfits of Science?
I do, actually.
Yeah. Courtney Cox's first real TV show. Certainly not her most successful one, but I was thinking about that because it's like Misfits of Science is strangely influential if you look at all the stuff that was very clearly influenced by it. Like Heroes.
Yes.
Heroes was influenced by Misfits of Science. For one thing, one of the major writers on Misfits of Science created Heroes. Did you know that?
I actually don't think I did.
Yeah, one of the main writers on Misfits of Science was the guy that created Heroes. And I just found this out last night. So yeah, we don't have a show of this to talk about. It's something that hit me last night, and I was thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you talk about that because I have a similar thought, and then we'll move on to our normal stuff. But over the last couple of days, I've been kind of laid up with an injured leg, so I haven't really been doing a whole lot of anything. So I've been going through the story releases for Magic the Gathering because they do this thing wherever they're about to release a new set. They do a whole bunch of story blurbs and side stories, and they do them in short story. They're fully realized, and there is actually like an arc in things that happen before the set releases or that's set in motion throughout the set. And I was doing the same thing. I was like, looking for the influences that harken back to other media. Like, okay, this reminds me of this show, and this reminds me of that show, or this reminds me of this book.
When is it a reference versus when is it an influence?
Yeah, exactly. And I was thinking about that same thing. So it's kind of interesting to bring that up. We will at some point probably talk about Dominaria, not this show, but in the future, because I find it fascinating. And I know several of you out there have made comments about that as well.
Yeah, the lore of Magic the Gathering is fascinating to me. The card play is not something I'm interested in, but the lore is interesting.
Especially with the crossovers in the D&D now, where they're actually making those worlds available. But we're not here to talk about that. And today we do actually have a couple things that we are going to talk about. But if you have a question or a theme idea or something you want us to cover topic-wise for this show or any of our other podcasts, you can go ahead and send them into podcast@blizzardwatch.com. If you are a Patreon supporter, you can go ahead and head over to our Discord server. We have a channel set aside for patron supporters. It's the Patron Q and Podcast Questions. We tend to look there first before anywhere else as a way of saying thank you to our Patreon supporters for allowing us to keep the lights on and do shows like this. And if you can't support us and email's not your thing, again, we understand. We do have one in our Discord server set aside for just podcasting Q questions. You can drop them there, and we do look there for multiple questions or topic ideas, and some of our past ones have actually come from there. But today we're going to start with, well, one is something we normally don't do, and Matt brought this up earlier. It's sort of a lore news thing. So with the alpha for Dragonflight in full swing and us coming up rapidly towards the end of the year and when the proposed release date of the next expansion is, things are starting to swirl as to questions of how the story is going to go. And we generally don't get a whole lot of tidbits, but we did actually. Steve Denauser, the narrative lead, who has guested on our podcast, all around decent folk, has actually made a blue post commenting on particularly where things are going to kind of be starting from. So Matt, you brought this to my attention. What are some of the big points in this post? I'm not going to read the whole thing to you folks at home.
Yeah, it's a fairly long post from Steve. My thoughts on it was, the interesting thing about it was the idea of wanting to let the story have a moment. One of the points Steve made was that if you actually look at the events of World of Warcraft, between every year and every other year since World of Warcraft launch, there's never not been a world-ending crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's been no time to, like, if you were a character who's been playing this game since 2004 when you started your first character, if that character is still playing, if you go back and look at the last 2 decades of their life, they've the grass has never gotten a chance to get any, do anything under their feet because they're never anywhere long enough to even like take a minute to breathe. It's just continuous. Oh, okay. Crazy fire lord about to destroy everything. Got to stop him. Oh, crazy dragon. Gotta stop him. Oh no. Old gods. Oh no, that's bad. Got to stop that. Oh, hey, Naxxramas is in the Plague Lands. Got to stop that. Oh, okay. Break time. Oh, wait, no, the demons have reopened the dark portal, so I got to go through that. So yeah, it just never stops. like every time you think, whew, okay, we've stopped Kil'jaeden from destroying the Sunwell. Now I'm sure it's time for plagued grain boxes. Are you for real? Are you for real? I was just about to take this drink. I was about to drink something. And it just keeps going. So one of the things they wanted to do when they moved from Shadowlands to Dragonflight was to establish, okay, Shadowlands took place over the course of a couple of years.
Yeah, a hard commitment to time, which we haven't really seen them do before.
Yeah, they had not been particularly saying how long it took or anything. Steve himself even makes that point that they usually don't say in-game how long these things took. They just kind of leave it nebulous in the game. They have a timeline, but they don't bother to, like, because people don't generally go, wow, it's been 2 years since X happened.
Unless you happen to be us and we, bombard you because you're on our show and we pinpoint you about, hey, what's time? Yeah. What is time? Baby, explain it. Explain it some more. Anyway, so the really interesting thing about this is that by doing that, by saying that the events of Shadowlands took 2 years, and it's been 3 years since then, from the beginning of Shadowlands to the beginning of Dragonflight is a 5-year period. And 3 of those years were relatively peaceful, which it may sound odd to us because we're used to that never being the case. But you got to think the people of Azeroth were like, thankful. Oh, man, after that Legion invasion, I thought for sure we were doomed. And then the sky ripped open. But, hey, it's okay now. It's okay now. And they got to, live. And I thought that was an interesting point. The other interesting point was that we're not going to come back to an Azeroth with, Gilneas already resettled. Yeah.
And, they're not having that stuff happen off screen. If it happens, it'll happen in the game when we're playing it. And I think that's an interesting decision. And I think to a certain degree, it's a good decision. And they're not going to have a series of novels happening in that 3-year gap to explain to us what happened during it, because people who play the game want to see that stuff in game.
Yes.
They don't want there to be multiple tie-in books. So they're going to do that. I think these are good decisions. I think it is a good decision to have a 3-year period where
nothing major happens.
Or, I'm sure stuff happened. I'm sure some warlord somewhere got his feathers uprooted and they had to go kick his butt or whatever But I like the idea that during this 3-year period, it'd be like that period in a D&D game where people create their first level characters. Mm-hmm. And yeah, stuff's happening in the world, but for you, it's all down to, hey, kobolds are attacking. And I kind of like that idea of this. The last 3 years have been a period where people could actually focus on, kobolds, instead of, armies of the undead coming to kill us.
What really struck me about this, too, is not only that the sort of, I don't want to say the hard commitment to a time, like I said, I don't want to say it was a hard commitment, but the commitment to actually saying, here's where we're starting, here's how much time has passed, is a really cool thing, especially for people that are our peers. And there's still a lot of role players in WoW, or people that maybe don't role play anymore, but do write stories revolving around their characters that, have been doing so for years. And the interesting thing is that giving us a definitive time frame between events, saying Shadowlands ended in year 37, Dragonflight's taking place in year 40, or at least starting in year 40, that gives you a definite 3-year time frame. And so for players like, myself, I used to keep a roving journal of my main character's story and exploits between expansions or between major content updates. What was downtime? What would I be doing during this time frame? But it was always nebulous. It was always left up to us, sort of what that time was and how much time really passed before it. And while there's still an element of that, which I appreciate, because it gives you that wiggle room of they're not saying that it's going to be this amount of time between updates as passed, or now we are in this year, or whatever the case is. But knowing how much time you have to play with between the end of one expansion and the beginning of another, It's nice. It's a nice little thing, especially when he makes a post like this talking about, yes, your characters would go back to their lives, and you're already adults technically at this point, or possibly, and what your characters would do, right?
If you're playing an adult character, 3 years is not so much that you look radically different,
right?
I mean, from speaking for myself, sometimes it is. Sometimes you do look radically different in 3 years. It depends on how hard the 3 years is.
Something and doing something. Anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, I do actually think one of the things I really like about this is what it reminds me of the most, though. It reminds me a lot of 4 years have passed since the Burning Legion. Sought to invade. It's just got that. It's a solid number. It's been a certain amount of years. Stuff has happened in the meantime, and we'll get to see it when we start playing it. You know what I mean? I just enjoy that. I think it's a nice approach to it.
Yeah, I think it really is a nice approach. I would agree with that. So, Steve, if you're listening, thank you very much for that post. I encourage everybody to go and read the full breadth of it. It is a wonderfully insightful and well-written post. While there may not be a lot of things in there for us to speculate about, I thought it was important from a narrative space, and Matt absolutely thought it was important from a narrative space for us to bring up. And I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, one of the things we don't really do here, because it's just not something we do, is give you lore news. Because by its nature, it's the kind of stuff we like to go into more detail on and speculate about and think about and play whack-a-mole with. But in this case, it just felt like this is something a lot of people will want to know. And there's nothing stopping us from telling you about it. I mean, it just feels like it works. So yeah, there you go.
Yeah. And we're going to move on from that, since there's not a whole lot more for us to speculate or comment on there. And we're going to move on to a topic that was actually started as a question from Tetsemi that was a little more specific and poignant, but got me thinking about a broader spectrum of things. I'll read the question, and then I'll go into what it sort of evolved into over the course of the last couple days of thinking about this. So, old gods, this, old gods, that, what about new gods? Where's the young brash upstart that decides in their time to take a seat in the pantheon? If you were to add to the Warcraft lore, who would you like to see elevated to godhood? How would they get there? And who's the arch enemy they acquired along the way for this ascension? And then a caveat here, godhood, define as you will, could be along the side Titan Watchers, could be a Titan, could be Ilaria becoming a Void Lord, kind of go crazy with this. So that was really what spawned the thought is divinity is a very odd topic in a lot of media. There are different rules or different takes on it, regardless of like what you're doing. So like if you're talking about comic books, gods are assumed differently there. Sometimes even inside of their own pages, the multiple different things are considered gods. Tabletop RPGs across all of the different systems and lores and story shells that are out there all view them differently depending on what your specific origin is. TV shows, movies, even folklore, in myths and legends, if you go across the world, deals with gods in very different ways and how somebody could be raised to godhood, or even if that is a possibility. Matt, do you have any specific thoughts where you want to start with this one?
Well, I'm going to take it back to Warcraft for a second, just because it was originally asked as a Warcraft question. One thing, we've actually kind of seen a sort of ascension into pseudo-godhood in Shadowlands. Vol'jin effectively becomes the Loa of Kings. Yep. He assumes that mantle. I don't know if that means he becomes the Loa that Princess
Talanji.
I can't remember. Thank you, Talanji. I was going to call it Talandra, and I know it's not Talandra. I don't know if he becomes, if she stays with bound to Bwonsamdi, or if Vol'jin takes over the role. But he has Razan's position. He is essentially Razan's reincarnation. And he's tied to Razan in a way where like the stuff that he does is part of that Loa. So we've seen that can happen, at least to that level. You could argue that what Arthas was almost a god. As Lich King, he, enormously powerful, certainly powerful enough to balk the jailer, and we saw Pelagos become the arbiter. Essentially, Pelagos has taken over the jailer's original function. He, if not a god, certainly close enough to a Titan. So there's interesting things like that. We still don't quite know what Elune is. We know that Elune is something.
We know Elune's an Aru. And wrote a post about that years ago.
Yeah. At any rate, we know that Elune there's a relationship with the Winter Queen, but we don't know what it is. We don't know how closely related they are. We don't know if Elune is essentially the same kind of thing that the Eternal Ones are. And we don't really know what the Eternal Ones are or what the first ones are.
Mm-hmm.
So the nature of these beings is nebulous. The old gods, we call them the old gods, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're gods. And that's, there's just a ton of nebulousness to this. Part of the problem and part of the interesting thing about it is we call Elune a god because she gets worshipped and she does things. That doesn't, is that what it takes to be a god? Like, what is the difference between, say, like a dragon aspect and a god? Like, can you pray hard enough to a dragon aspect and get what you want? There's just a lot to it. I was thinking, here's an example of something that I've always found interesting. We're going to switch gears to a comic book for a second, then I'll let Joe talk. One of my favorite characters is Superman. I've never made any bones about that. I love the character. I love the mythology. I love the thing that a lot of people don't like about him is the Boy Scoutedness, but also the power.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard for some people to wrap their heads around the idea that Superman could even be beaten in a fight, that there's any danger to him in what he does. And I will point out that every single character in a comic book is invulnerable until the writer decides to do a special episode where they're not. Batman is not going to get shot by a guy with a zip gun unless they they decide that would be a good story. So all characters are equally omnipotent and immune. It doesn't matter if they have cosmos shaking power or, punch muggers. So that's not a problem for me. But one of the things I always found interesting about the character is that you could call Superman a god, but he's shown many times to not be one. That he has emotions, that he's fallible. I know you say the Greek gods are like that too, but I'm getting there. Moreover, that he can't. There's none of the braggadocio and there's none of the omnipotence. There are limits to Superman. There are things he can't do. He couldn't save his planet. He couldn't. He was a baby, but he can't fix the bottle city of Kandor. He can't do these things. He couldn't stop his foster father from dying. And they always when they put the character up against an actual god, a lot of times Superman will beat that character. Superman has physically beaten Darkseid up, but there's no mistaking that Darkseid is an actual god and is significantly more powerful than Superman is. Significantly. He can do things that Superman couldn't even dream about doing. And that's not a problem for the character. And I don't think it is an interesting thing to consider. In Marvel, there are more characters who are called gods or who actually are gods in some way or form. In the movies, he's an alien, but in the comics, Thor is literally Thor. The character Thor that you see in the comic books is Thor, the mythological figure. That's his life story. There are a few things that are different, but generally speaking, if you read a Norse myth, that Norse myth actually happened to the comic book guy you're seeing right there. That's the same guy. And that comes through in some of the stories. One of the most interesting stories I've ever read was one where Thor is talking to Captain America and he goes, sometimes when I come back, I'm just so glad that you're all still here. I have no idea how much time passes. When I leave and go back to Asgard, time is different there. And when I come here, I'm worried you won't be here anymore. That someday I'll come back and you'll all have been dead for centuries. Because this has happened to me before. I've left to pursue, my duties in Asgard. And when I came back, hundreds of years had passed and everybody I knew and loved was gone. And that's just, there's a perspective difference that's as important as anything to do with raw power. If I were creating a pantheon of gods, I would think about that. I think about why do we have gods? Especially, let's assume for a moment, in our day-to-day lives, we will never know, never intellectually know about God, unless, some of us have faith, and faith is great. I'm not arguing against it. I'm just saying faith and knowledge are two different things. So we live our lives, whatever our spiritual decisions are, whatever our religious beliefs are, we live our lives in a box where we'll never know, as long as we're alive, what's going to happen. And therefore, our religions are formed around certain ideas. There's certain things that come out of them. One of the ones that really comes to mind is, you've played Dragon Age, right?
Of course.
Did you play Dragon Age Inquisition?
Yep, sure did.
The revelations about the gods of the elves and who Solus was. I mean, obviously, Solus isn't a god. Like you can talk to him, you can see him, he's mortal, he's fallible. But at the same time, he is the person that his people, call the Dread Wolf. He is that being. He did that thing that is so monumental and unthinkable. That he created the veil and sundered like the spirit realm from the mortal realm. He did that. So in a way, his claim to godhood is pretty valid. Like he did the thing. This thing happened because he decided it should. So you have to think about what makes someone a god.
Yeah, and I think that's the root of the question, because, and the thing is there is no singular answer, right? And then
it depends entirely on the context of what you're in. Like I mentioned, Darkseid. Darkseid's a god, but it's different than say Thor.
But I mean, let's talk about DC Comics for a moment too. Like even contained within, if you go no further than the DC universe. The DC universe has actual born gods. You mentioned or gods or beings that are so powerful that they might as well be gods. You mentioned Darkseid. There's also Metron, right? Metron is part of that group. Zeus exists in the DC universe as well as the Marvel universe, but he is the actual god of that pantheon. Trigon, who is not necessarily technically a god, but a demonic ruler of the underrealms, but still is on power comparable to the others, is often worshipped as a god. You have Morpheus.
Yeah, you've got Trigon and Necron. You've got others too, and you were mentioning Morpheus. You've got Morpheus and all the other Endless, and then you've got the Presence.
Yep, I was going to say you got the Presence. You also have Wonder Woman, who is at this point a god.
Well, demigod.
Well, demigod. And then you also have rules around that which seem to shift. There was a version of, I want to say it was Dark Knight's Metal, where Bruce Wayne killed Ares and took the place as the God of War. Because
one of the alternate Bruce Waynes in that. Yeah.
But I mean, the rules shift depending on context, even within framework of its own universe.
If you look at even in actual historical religious thought, even in actual mythology, the emperors of Rome were all considered to become deified upon death.
Mm-hmm.
They got their own cults. People prayed to them. Now, keep in mind that the way Romans viewed religion was different, but they believed that they were divine. Not while they were alive, not while they were emperor. While they were emperor, they were just men. But if they died naturally and their cult was established, they were then considered to be gods.
Yep.
So apotheosis, we have a word for it. We have apotheosis. That word means to become a god. So the very fact that we've got a word for it means that it's something humans have been thinking about for a very long time.
Agreed.
I want to go back to what you just mentioned, because I think there's more to bring out of it. Let's talk about Spider-Man.
Yeah. Okay.
The Spider Totem thing that J. Michael Straczynski brought in, a lot of people thought it was dumb. And I understand why they thought it was dumb, but it does one thing really well, is it takes Spider-Man out of the realm of purely I am an accident, and therefore it's unique to me, and turns it into something that anybody could be involved with, which is a big part of the appeal of Spider-Man. From the beginning, Stan Lee mentioned that the reason Spider-Man spoke to so many people was because he could be anybody under that mask.
Yep.
And they've kind of codified it with like Miles Morales and so forth. So at this point, having brought this hot potato of a topic up, I'm going to throw it at Joe and see what he has to say.
So the Spider Totem has always been an interesting thing for me, because I am personally in the camp of somebody who enjoys it, because it also broadens sort of the universe surrounding Spider-Man. There's always been a discussion around that character of why are they so powerful? Why could he stick to a surface and not be pulled off of it by the Hulk? Why did the Beyonder once say that he has limitless potential, but he limits himself and therefore can never reach his full potential? And that's probably for the best. And they started doing this whole thing where the Spider Totem is a multiversal supernatural entities that were created by the goddess Neith, if I remember correctly. And it harkens back to the web of life and destiny, where the Great Weaver, the Gatekeeper, the Other, the Bride, the Scion, and the Pattern Maker, as well as others, are sort of aspects of this totem made manifest. And they can exist anywhere in the multiverse, in some cases multiple forms of them in the multiverse. During the Inheritance run, we actually see the Spider Totems and people of the Spider Totem being hunted by the Inheritors, which was a whole other role of that. But then there was this concept of the Great Totems. The Great Totems were these things that maintain the web of destiny and life. And so technically, Peter falls, the Totem of Spider-Man falls into that role where they must exist. It's an interesting concept. I could talk about this for probably a couple hours by itself because it has come up multiple times, but please go ahead.
I'm saying the reason I brought it up was partially because I like Joe getting nerdy about Spider-Man's function, but also because you would not think of Spider-Man as a god, to look at him. Sure, strong, has superpowers and all that, but still street level, quippy. But he fits the trickster archetype better than any character in Marvel, including Loki, who is an actual trickster god.
Or, of course, in this context, it's called the Other, but yes.
Yeah, but that concept, I'm not even talking about the Inheritor stuff per se. That's just the in-universe rationale for this. In terms of his storytelling role, Spider-Man resembles nobody quite so much as a fusion of Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd.
Yeah.
He's like both characters in one person. He's got the Parker luck. He has misfortune in his life. He doesn't always know what to do or how to get through it, but he also has that manic guise he puts on. And spiders are really great for this because spiders, the web archetype, the web making archetype is a thing that is created. It is a pattern. It has this, vast, symmetry to it, which underlies that whole concept of being the yin and yang in one being. If you look at the stuff they've done with Spider-Man over the years, one of my favorite stories of all time is a Spider-Man story where Firelord, the Herald of Galactus, comes to Earth and he's angry about something. And Spider-Man just tries to, he's the only one around for some reason and tries to get him to just calm down. And Firelord takes offense to it and begins attacking him. And the more Spider-Man tries to defuse the situation, the more aggressive and angry Firelord becomes. Until finally, Spider-Man has done everything to keep this dude away from people, done everything to keep him from hurting people, and he just snaps. And he beats up a Herald of Galactus by himself.
A galactic being that had once stood before the might of even Thanos.
Yeah, this is a guy who's on the Silver Surfer level of power.
Mm-hmm.
And the Silver Surfer has done things like wave his hand and take the Hulk out, just with one hand wave. And Spider-Man just unloads on this guy and takes him down. Now, Joe just mentioned Thanos. Spider-Man has beaten Thanos
multiple times.
Yeah, but by himself, after everybody else went down. There's a classic story that basically presages the Infinity Gauntlet, where Thanos is getting his hands on a cosmic cube. And a cosmic cube is the Tesseract from the movies. You know what it is. In the comics, they're not quite the same, but the cosmic cube can basically grant you anything you can think of. The downside is you have to be able to think of it and keep thinking of it while you've got it in your hand. Thanos grabbed it and used it to make himself God. The capital G God. His face is up in the sky in the stars. Problem is that the cube was still on the ground in his hand. Now, he'd taken everybody else out, but Spider-Man has spider sense. And Spider-Man's spider sense is terrifyingly accurate. Like, if you ever stop and think about Spider-Man,
specifically Peter Parker, because not all the Spider-Men have spider sense. Not
all of them have it, but Peter Parker does. Peter's spider sense is terrifyingly accurate. It's one of the most accurate precognitions in existence. It's also kind of hard to read because it just goes, ah! It's just something yelling in the back of your head, bad! But once you know how to use it, you could avoid almost anything with it. Combining all of his other abilities with it, he successfully avoided Thanos' strike. Thanos turned himself into God, but left his body behind with the cube in his hand. So Spider-Man just went over and took the cube out of his hand and could successfully wish Thanos back into his body and beat. He's smart enough to do that and strong-willed enough to make it work. This is a character that, on the face level of it, is kind of a gawpy, annoying teenager, but who might actually be a god.
Which is why, that always stuck with me as a kid before they codified it, was during the Secret Wars, during the original Secret Wars, when the Beyonder, a cosmic godlike entity, was commenting specifically to another god about Peter, about Spider-Man, and sort of laying the groundwork for this in the 70s?
No, it was
or 80s?
Late 80s.
Late 80s.
Don't do that to me.
Yeah, sorry. The late 80s, like we're talking like
2 years before Crisis on Infinite Earths came out.
Yeah. Regardless, though, the point is that comics do this thing where all forms of godhood exist, even things that aren't traditionally a god, a being that has essentially always existed at that level of power can be created. We've seen Thor inherit further power as Thor takes on the mantle of Odin and becomes the Allfather. We've seen Jane Foster become Thor, basically adopt into godhood. We've seen this from multiple other locations. It's wide and varied. And
there's a story coming out now in comics, and I do want to talk about other media, but in comics right now, there's a story called Judgment Day coming out, which is the X-Men, Eternals, and Avengers crossover. In that storyline, some of the Eternals have decided we're going to just kill all the mutants. But others of the Eternals are like, nope, this is a bad idea. And in order to stop the other Eternals, they turn to the Avengers, and they're going to make a new Celestial.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to make a new Celestial. And Celestials are, if you know what the Celestials are, if you watch any of the Marvel stuff or their own thing, it's basically the same thing. They're going to make a new one, a brand new one. The Celestials are so powerful that one of them took out the entirety of Earth's deities when they tried to stop them from interfering with Earth. And they're just making a new one. And the best part is they're patterning it after Tony Stark, because Tony Stark linked to a Celestial at one point, and so his nervous system still has sympathetic echoes. So it's going to have Tony Stark as its mental pattern.
Well, because, the Avengers currently live in a
Celestial. They live, yeah. So I'm just imagining, that's the Celestial they're turning into. They're making a new one out of that one. So yeah, it's that kind of stuff happens. But let's, for a minute, I want to move us to a video game, but okay. You had a thing to say. So why don't you do the thing you were going to say?
I was actually going to move us to tabletop role-playing games, but if we're going to do video games, absolutely.
I feel like there's one video game we should talk about here.
Go for it.
God of War.
Yeah. Okay.
Because God of War, you see everything we're talking about. You're seeing gods die. You're seeing people rise to godhood. You're seeing people get knocked down from godhood to get back up and get up to godhood again. You're seeing the Titans, who are technically not gods, but are the parents and lovers of the gods and are where the gods come from. The word Titans, it's interesting, because the word Titans in Greek mythology, the original word that we anglicize as Titans, means the strainers. And it's because they overthrew their father.
Mm-hmm.
Uranos, Kronos and Rhea formed the Titans. Kronos castrated his father, Uranos, as he came down to mate with Gaia, the earth, and threw him down. He was no longer king of heaven. It became Kronos' job. And that's why the Titans were called the Strainers, because they were usurpers. And the Olympians are, of course, also usurpers, because they do the exact same thing to Kronos. Because that was Uranus' curse to Kronos, was that he'll have the exact same thing happen to him. And because the Greeks love this kind of thing, hearing that prophecy, Uranos didn't decide, well, I'll be nice to my kids. He decided, I'll eat all my kids. That'll stop that. And it didn't, it obviously. But God of War takes those themes of parents and children and uses its divine, I don't know what you'd call it, divine panoply, its divine backstory to showcase those very real, normal themes, which is what mythology has always been.
And I think the most recent game to come out in the series really did that the best, right? Like, it really showcased what that was.
Well, yeah, because let's be honest, the original games were basically an excuse to watch a guy scream and kill and rip things in half.
100%. But with the current one, went into that sort of complex structure of godhood, dealing mainly with the Norse and Greek gods, but mostly the Norse gods at this point. But the complicated interplay of that, the fallibility of it, and the interesting thing to me, what Matt's pointing out, is that sort of like the rearing into godhood, right? Spoiler warning for a game that came out several years ago at this point. But Kratos has a son in this game, and because he's a god, his kid is also going to be a god. He's going to inherit at least a portion of that divinity, depending on who his wife or mate was. And then we come to find out that in this particular retelling of the Greek pantheon, he is the father of Loki. That is the big twist. But Loki, throughout most of that first game, doesn't realize he's a god. He doesn't even know he's Loki yet. He only knows himself as Atreus, a Greek name.
Yeah, the name Loki is the name his mother would have given him.
which we find out at the end, which is sort of the big thing. But it's this interesting thing where he doesn't realize he's a god. Then he's told that he's a god, reacts very, very, very poorly to it, and then has to be brought back down to a more human level, because that's sort of how that pantheon and that storyline work. Is godhood is tempered by humanity.
And there's the really great exchange between the two that I think Joe is talking about, is when, after an entire game of being non-communicative and surly, because that's, it's Kratos. I mean, and he's played by Christopher Judge in this game, and he does an amazing job of it. But after an entire game of that, he finally snaps, and instead of screaming at his son and bullying him, just tells him, yeah, that was my father. I killed him. And he's like, is that just what it is? Is that, sons killing fathers? He goes, I don't know, but we can be better. Mm-hmm. We can choose what kind of gods we are. And that, that is, I think, a big part of what the divinity in that storyline is for. It's to illustrate these things that are just as true when you're talking to, you talking to, say, your little brother or your kid now. You may not be a god, but you're still, there's a lot of negative aspects to life, to being human, to being a man or a woman in our society. And you can look at those things and be dragged under by them, or you can say, no, we can choose who we are. Mm-hmm. And this actually ties back to the Spider-Man thing too, because a lot of the Spider Totem thing is really just a way to explain that this is not something people are born to. It's something that chooses them, yes, but it's also something they choose. Miles doesn't have to put on the mask and go out and do that. He's not Peter Parker. He doesn't have the psychological compulsion to do it because he feels responsible for the death of his uncle. He does it because he thinks it's the right thing to do. That he, because that the message of with great power comes great responsibility is one that works for anybody. And Peter learned it one way, but it's part of this whole thing, and it is absolutely something that you see with other characters.
Agreed. And it's another interesting thing. Like, if you haven't played it yet, for this particular exchange, to really kind of get the idea behind it and sort of the passing of the mantle, play the Spider-Man game that originally from Insomniac Games. Go ahead and play it. It's on PC now. It's worth it. But I want to move away from video games for a moment and comic books and talk specifically about tabletop role-playing games, at least for a little while, because each game that exists sort of has its own way of dealing with divinity, and how gods exist and die and are reborn or replaced. I'm going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons specifically at first, because I think it's the most ubiquitous or well-known as far as what's out there as available to players, and I think will probably resonate to a broader audience. There are a couple very simple concepts that have been around for a while, and I don't know if they've been around for the entire time. I'd have to go back and reread books that predate my birth. But gods can die in Dungeons and Dragons in the way their universes are set up. Mm-hmm. A god can die, and their body doesn't, a physical form is projected into the astral sea, essentially, and becomes a landmass there, becomes a sleeping husk. Their divine spark can then be taken over by another being that can assume their portfolio, or it could be replaced by somebody else. Another god absorbs that portfolio. There is a natural order to how folks can actually be raised to godhood, as it is described that the original gods that existed were all once mortal, that did great deeds of heroism, and were worshipped by their people as if they were gods, and thus became gods, which is absolutely fascinating. And go ahead.
Thing, while Joe's talking about this, he said we were getting away from video games, but the entire plot to Baldur's Gate 2 is about this. And it literally takes you to the husk in the astral sea of a dead god, the god Baal, Lord of Murder, where your character ultimately decides, do I supplant him? Do I absorb his divine essence and become his replacement? Do I allow it to pass into the cosmos and for somebody else to effectively get it at some point in the future? Or do I turn it into something else? And that's something that's still in the game to a degree. I mean, one of the most famous examples of a character pulling this off is Vecna.
Yeah. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Vecna started off as a lich. He started off, in fact, originally as a wizard who didn't want to die, and so he became a lich, and as part of his whole phylactery deal, he created his hand and his eye, which eventually became so powerful in their own right that they became artifacts. Vecna became so powerful that one of his lieutenants, his weapon became an artifact because it was devoted to killing him. Like the Sword of Kaz, if you've ever heard of it. It was wielded by his vampire lieutenant Kaz, who is the reason he got killed the first time. Kaz turned against Vecna and struck him down from behind, and that act of betrayal made the sword an artifact. That's what the deal Vecna was. As a Lord of Secrets and Mysteries, though, Vecna keeps coming back because, that's the nature of a secret. You can't really... If a secret's a secret, it doesn't really go away. There's always more things to find out, more mysteries to plunder and all that.
And there's always going to be hints of it, which is like... Yeah. We have a Candlekeep game, or at least we had a Candlekeep game that was going. I think Liz is still running it occasionally, question mark.
She hasn't run in a while just because life has been too chaotic.
But there's a lot of things where like that's a repository of information that exists as sort of like a central hub that may have whispers and rumors of divine powers or of Vecna or whatever the case is. But D&D has always, I shouldn't say always, I believe it was codified in like 3rd or 3.5 where they actually like ranked out divine power, actually ranked out how portfolios work and things like that. And
they did, yeah. Some of that was from 2nd edition, and some of that goes all the way back to the original deities and demigods.
That's true.
And then there's the basic sets, Immortals rules, and the Immortals rules are even more complicated. But yeah, basically, yes, I agree with it.
And the way that they rank them is you have your quasi-deities or hero deities. These are beings that are immortal, but usually cannot grant spells or have worship or grant spells to their worshippers. You have demigods, who are the weakest of the divine, actual true divine pantheon. They're able to grant spells and perform a few deeds that are beyond mortal limits. Technically, like Archfey follows somewhere in between demigods and lesser deities. Lesser deities are entities who perform more powerful deeds than demigods can, and have a more refined portfolio, as well as more followers. You have intermediate, which are they control larger godly realms than demigods or lesser gods, but less than greater deities, which are typically the ones that have millions of mortal worshippers. They command like a certain respect among even other deities, and some of these greater deities even rule over other pantheons. This is when you start getting into like the elven pantheons, the dwarven pantheons, the human pantheons, and when they have specific portfolios of who they worship for what and how they interact with each other. And then there's something that I don't think we've actually seen in 5th edition yet, which is over deities.
Yeah, like AO. We haven't seen him.
Yeah, these are entities that are beyond the understanding of mortal knowledge. Nobody knows how they became over deities, if they were gods that just ascended beyond greater deities or whatever the case is. But they've essentially always existed. So it's an interesting look as far as godhood in a tabletop setting is concerned. And I've always found it fascinating. In a game that I've recently played in, where for 5 years we were chasing a thread of a story arc involving the goddess of fate, in this case Istis. We were able to murder Istis and reignite the spark of the god that Istis had killed and taken the place of the goddess of the pantheon of fate. Because D&D had that sort of codified. And it was interesting because it was one of those surreal experiences where at that point our characters killed a god, our player characters. If we can kill a god, how far removed from godhood are we at that point? So, and I'm going to shut up and let Matt talk for a while.
I was hoping you'd take a little longer so I could see if I actually got anything off this boss. You got me so interested in godhood that I went and jumped on Alpha and Tomb of Sargeras, because Sargeras has got me thinking about that idea of if you can kill a god, does that make you a god? Which does take me then to Shadowrun, and specifically not just Shadowrun, but Earth Dawn. Earth Dawn and Shadowrun are interesting concepts because they're not currently published by the same company. They're actually published by 2 different companies. I don't know one of them is a European company, I think Catalyst, although they might have lost the rights by now. Who's publishing Shadowrun nowadays?
Shadowrun's still Catalyst.
Okay. One of the interesting things about the Shadowrun world is that it is I think it's the 6th world.
Yes.
It's the realm, the world that we're living into up until the time of the Great Ghost Dance in Shadowrun. And it would take too long to explain all the lore of Shadowrun, but the world up until the Return of Magic was the 5th world. And the end of the 5th world And the beginning of the sixth world is when magic returns and the dragons wake up, and people with a stronger tradition of magical abilities in their culture got the magic back and used it and changed the face of the earth.
Or those that have, for lack of a better term, genetic dissension from the original fantasy races began to mutate as well.
Yeah,
right?
The goblinization and so forth. The people turned into elves and so forth. As a result of all this, one of the dragons was a dragon named Dunkelzahn. Extremely powerful, extremely wise, and a survivor of the fourth world. The fourth world is the time of Earth Dawn. And Earth Dawn is the fourth world because the third world that preceded it was killed by things called horrors. And the horrors are they're kind of like Lovecraftian nightmare things. They're sort of like the old gods from Warcraft or what have you, but they're literally arcanivores. They eat magic.
Yep. And
as a result, the more magic that exists in a world, the more drawn to that world horrors are. And the horrors have very specific limitations. For instance, horrors cannot do true art. They cannot express things creatively. If a horror possesses a human body and is using that body, and that human body is, say, an artist at sword combat, the horror cannot replicate their artistry. All their strikes will be killing strikes. There will never be any flourishes. There will never be anything creative about it. They'll be as good at sword fighting as they were, but none of the art will be there anymore. And that's because that's something they eat. They eat magic. They eat creativity. They can't produce it. If they could produce it for themselves, they wouldn't need to come eat entire worlds. In order to live through the horrors the last time, the peoples of the third world created these underground cairns and sealed them off. And the horrors couldn't get through the walls to get in. Sometimes they did, and they would kill everybody. But as a result, the magic level then drops and drops and drops, and eventually the world doesn't have enough magic to sustain the horrors, and they leave. Earth Dawn, there's for some reason around 72,000 years ago, the magic stops dropping at a point where you can still use magic, but not enough that the horrors can just wander around freely. They have to be called into the world and fed with direct magic. So there's this period of time that Dunkelzahn was alive for, where he saw the horrors firsthand and knew what they were. And so when the sixth world starts, Dunkelzahn realizes, our magic is just going to keep going up and up and up and up, and they'll come back. And these people are not freaking ready for this. They have no way of dealing with it. Throughout his storyline, Dunkelzahn puts himself into a position where he becomes elected the president of the UCAS, the United Canadian and American States, which is kind of like I want to say the successor to the United States.
Kinda, because most of the United States went back to the native people at this time.
I'd say half, not most, half.
75%.
No, man, they really didn't get anything past the Mississippi, but they did get Mexico. So but regardless, since he knows what's coming, he deliberately gets himself elected president and then has himself killed. He assassinates himself. And when he does this, he makes a hole in the area where he's killed that is essentially a funnel that drains magic out of the world of Shadowrun.
Mm-hmm.
And in so doing, keeps the level from getting to the point where the horrors can come in. And he is in that hole, essentially keeping it open in the astral plane, which essentially means he is the guardian now of that entire world. In his death, he has essentially gone through an apotheosis. He's become a god. He's a specific god. He's the god of keeping horrible Lovecraftian monsters from coming back and eating everything. But in a way, he's a god now. He can't die. He can't even really be affected by anything. You can't touch him because he's literally in a vortex of magical power.
For some reason, I remember that he was only god for 10 hours.
Yeah. I think that actually is possibly a reference to the game as well, though.
I think so, too.
Yeah, I think they actually do that. But it's one of those really interesting things, and it's not the first time they did that. One of my favorite adventures from Shadowrun, did you ever do the one with Harlequin?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the Harlequin Adventure was one of my favorites. And that Harlequin and Aeron are also survivors of that incredibly distant past. They've actually lived right through to the modern day as elves, even as the magic level dropped. And then as it began coming up, they lived through all that. So they too understood that the world was fragile and things were going to happen. They had very different opinions on how to deal with that, but they both knew it was going to happen. Shadowrun has that interesting concept of at what point have you lived long enough and seen enough and done enough to essentially be a god.
Mm-hmm.
Like, doesn't either Harlequin or Aaron blows up Mount St. Helens again?
I think it's Harlequin.
Yeah, and that's like the kind of thing they can do, So it is. Shadowrun's one of the more interesting ones in my opinion in terms of like godhood and the nature of divinity and how one would pursue it in that world. You got another one you want to talk about before we go, or?
I was going to say, I want to bring it back to Warcraft for just sort of to close this out. This is one of the things that I think is fascinating coming back to like World of Warcraft in general is when it was first conceived, it had a very clear delineation of godhood. It had heavens and hells, very similar to a Diablo-esque split. There was no titans, there was no light. It just was essentially God and then the devil. It wasn't called that, but that's essentially what it was. And that it has evolved over time to be much more loose in its interpretation of what a deity is, or what even is considered a deity. Because again, we have priests, and those priests worship the light, but the light itself is not a deity, not in a traditional sense. We talk about how the light can be wielded. It will fill whoever calls to it and is worthy of holding it, even throughout undeath. So it doesn't really have a conscious, like, I don't want to say it doesn't have a will, but it doesn't really seem to be a sentient creation or being like you would normally ascribe to a god. But it absolutely can do things like raise the dead, protect against insurmountable odds, heal the most grievous of wounds, cure the worst diseases. It can do all these things that we would classify somebody as a god could do, but isn't traditionally a god. You have we talked about the Titans. They're incredibly powerful beings that can literally shape worlds and have helped shape the universe that we know, at least as much as we know of it. But again, are they gods, or do they just have that sort of power? And that's what I kind of like about Warcraft is the term god, aside from old gods, doesn't really get thrown around. And in the case of old gods, we call them that because their minions call them that, because that's what their subjects called them. So we sort of accepted that designation. Even when the Pantheon is dealing with it, even when Mother is in the laboratory trying to experiment and accidentally creating an old god, they call them old gods. They don't call them void entities. God doesn't carry the same connotation in Warcraft. And I think that's sort of the important distinction in how they handle that. You can have sufficiently powerful beings can do incredibly crazy, heroic, and special things, but aren't necessarily worshipped as gods.
I mean, look at the jailer himself. The jailer doesn't claim godhood.
Nope.
At no point does the jailer say, I am a god. Nor does the jailer call the first ones gods. I wanted to actually really briefly tie upon one thing I think is really important when thinking about, say, the Titans or other things like the Titans in Warcraft, in that there's a direct line of descent from Jack Kirby to the guys who were designing Warcraft back in the 90s. And that they were like, you're talking about guys like Chris Metzen and Samwise Didier were comic book fans. And they were artists who drew in a style very much inspired by the comic books they'd read. And it's clear when you go to Ulduar and look around, it's like a Jack Kirby drawing. It's Kirby's Eternals, it's Kirby's Celestials, it's Kirby's, Fourth World stories. That's very much a part of the DNA of the Titans and the things like them in the Warcraft universe. The whole deal with Sargeras, there's a direct line of descent from Darkseid to Sargeras. Like you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at it and say, oh, that's where that came from. And it's not a ripoff. It's not the same story, but it's just that idea of, beings like Algalon who show up and the quote unquote herald of the Titans make these cosmic pronouncements. That's the kind of thing we're looking at. So I think there's definitely a tendency in Warcraft to avoid. It doesn't matter what you call them. What matters is what they're doing. And there's nothing in Warcraft that you cannot ultimately solve with like between 9 to 23 other people. You know what I mean? Like, it's just part of the nature of the game is that these beings can be defeated. There's always a way to stop them. There's never anything that you can't get a bunch of mortals together and stop, even if it does seem impossible because it's insanely powerful. There's a way to do it. And so the idea of a god in Warcraft is much more nebulous on purpose. Once they become something we know what it is, they're much less terrifying, if that makes sense.
And at this point, we tend to find out, or at least know, about a lot when it comes to those types of beings. It's generally our job as player characters to do exactly that. We'll go through, we fought a reawakened avatar of Sargeras. We fought Argus. We've fought the Jailer. We have fought old gods. We have fought huge cosmic entities that by all stretch of the imagination should be wiping the floor with us. However, we learned about them beforehand. Once they're knowable, they're handleable. You can take care of it. And that's one thing that I do appreciate about the Warcraft universe, is that so far nothing has been presented that is beyond our grasp. Technically not even death at this point, because we just learned a whole lot about that over the last, now we know 2 years in game. So there's a lot to think about there. And the topic of divinity has always been interesting in media because, again, everybody has their own way of doing it. Everyone,
Joe mentioned Morpheus from the Sandman storylines and the Endless and their relationships to death and other concepts. In that, there's this, there's been so many different kinds of TV shows and movies that have dealt with this kind of thing that there's no way we could touch upon all of it. If you're going to mention like the Percy Jackson books or Tolkien's vast mythology, and the fact that, when you're looking at Tolkien, Sauron isn't even the first big evil lord. He's the first evil lord's lieutenant. So there's a lot. Just the mythology behind the Lord of the Rings stuff is
try to read the Silmarillion sometime, and it's thick.
Yeah, well, try and read the actual Elder Edda sometime if you want to get confused.
Also thick.
Yeah, but yeah, there's a lot. This is a topic we could have been going on about for much longer than we did. We didn't even touch upon like a lot of video games, like the Divinity series.
Yep. The
Divinity games are all about divinity, and we didn't even get there. So yeah, there is a lot to this. We didn't even we barely mentioned the Loa and the Wild Gods and the ones from Pandaria, the August Celestials.
Yep.
Who are all related. They're all basically the same kind of thing.
But again, they're insanely powerful beings that are capable of amazing feats, but not unkillable, right? And they're not omniscient either. They know a lot, just not everything.
Their cosmos is actually, we've just found out that their cosmos is actually designed around the idea that they will die.
Yep.
And come back. So yeah.
Except Ursoc, they did my boy dirty. Anyway.
I think Ursoc's coming back at some point.
I hope. But it's an interesting concept, and it's actually one that I'm curious if you out there, our listeners, have an opinion on. If you feel that there's a story, a book, or a comic, a movie, a TV show, or a video game that you feel handles divinity in a good way, or in a way that fascinates you, or something that you think is well done, I'd be interested to hear about that. Be sure to let us know. Do you have anything to add before I close out?
I'm going to say this because we talked about Marvel for a while. Marvel has so many different things that are kind of gods or like gods or more powerful than gods or whatever, that if you stop and actually look at it all, it's ridiculous. And it goes up and down. There's beings that are so amazingly powerful that they're more powerful than the divine embodiment of the entire universe. So yeah, there's a lot out there on that topic.
But if you have a topic that you'd love us to cover, be sure to go ahead and send it in. You can send it to podcast@blizzardwatch.com. Specify what show it's for. Don't forget, we have 3 of them. Don't make us fight over it. I'm far too injured to be fighting Matt at this point. It's just not fair.
It's really not fair for anybody to have to fight me because I cheat. I cheat a lot.
That's fair. You can go ahead and also send them in our Discord server. We do have our Patreon Q and podcast questions. channel for our Patreon supporters. We give you first billing. We do also have our Q and podcast questions channel if you can't support us on Patreon. But our outro will always remind you, Blizzard Watch is made possible due to the generous contributions of those Patreon supporters at patreon.com/BlizzardWatch. Your continued support means this podcast setting community is able to thrive and grow. Blizzard Watch supporters enjoy exclusive benefits like early access to the podcast, better chance at having your question answered on our podcast with a queue, and an ads-free site experience. So thank you very much, folks. We'll see you next week.